Hi, I'm ML Matt Buchman. Thanks for joining me for 5 Insider Factoids, which is answers to questions readers have sent in or asked me in person. So let's talk about the origins of the Miranda Chase series. There's some minor spoilers in this video, but nothing that'll affect your enjoyment of the books. So how did I get from writing romance to writing thrillers? And that's actually a kind of odd story. Um, the way I got into the romances to begin with was I wrote a book and I didn't quite know what it was. And so it was either a romance with thriller elements or a thriller with romance elements, or I didn't know. So I started sending it out to editor after editor, got 39 rejections on The Night Is Mine, book number one in the series. And finally, an editor called me up and said, I want this, tell me about it. And I told her about it, and she said, that's not a romance. So we went through a lot of changes, and um, I sold the series as military romantic suspense. But as I wrote more and more of the Emily Beale and the Night Stalkers universe and the spin-offs of the Firehawks and Delta Force and White House Protection Force, they kept moving more and more over toward thriller. And I finally got the idea of let's scrape all my reviews. So my wife, bless her, went out and took all the reviews I'd received on Apple, Kobo, Amazon, Goodreads, and I threw them all into a word cloud. And I said, okay, what are the most common words that my fans are giving me about my own books? And there were all the romance tropes, heroes, all those things, happy ever after. There were all those keywords. But there was also all of the thriller keywords: excitement, edge of your seat, suspense, thriller. And it was like I had realized that I had slowly been shifting closer and closer to thriller, which I'd originally started out in before I sold The Night Stalkers #1 with my Dead Chef series, which is a foodie thriller series. So the Emily Beale universe went through Dead Chef and became these NTSB techno thrillers. And that's how I shifted over into the thrillers for now. I'm sure I'll go back to romance and so on at some point. Um, but it was it was a nice break to step away from the romance structure, but also to have that thriller structure and just focus on that new craft of pace and excitement and edge of your seat. I really loved doing this transition. So, who are the NTSB if these are NTSB techno thrillers? The United States National Transportation Safety Board is a governmental agency that has no control. Their, their job is to go out, investigate plane crashes, and report to recommendations to the FAA to suggest to the makers of planes or air traffic controllers or safety procedures. So it's strictly an advisory board. That's why there's board at the end of it rather than agency or something. And they they're strictly an investigative role. They've got 5 regional offices across the country, I think. One is the headquarters is in DC. They're quite small. They're only about 400 people total, and they have 5 areas of responsibility. Their job is to look at highway crashes, so the problems they're having with autonomous cars, occasionally killing people, um, that's investigated by the NTSB. Rail accidents, pipeline, maritime, and planes. So of the 400, there's this even smaller group that looks at aircraft accidents and goes out to look at when a plane falls out of the sky. And what they do is they go in and they uncrank the mechanics of the accident. They go back to root causes. Was it human error? Was it mechanical error? Was it a failure in design? Was it a failure in procedure? And they take this, they reverse engineer those little scraps of metal scattered all over a field. And they say, the problem is right there. And then so they send advice for the FAA to go, yes, everybody fix that right there. So that's what they do. And the reason I chose them is my dream as a kid, my big dream was to fly the big commercial airliners. I wanted to fly the big planes full of people. As a little kid, I thought that was the coolest thing. Got my private pilot's license. I met a pilot in senior year of college, and he was a junior. He was a year behind me, but he made his living as a charter pilot and instructor. So Mikey the pilot helped me get my private license, and it wasn't until my second FAA inspection, the medical inspection, that I learned I was partially colorblind, a little bit red-green colorblind. I could have still flown, but I never would have been allowed to fly the big airliners, which had been the dream. So I just dropped the whole thing. And I miss it still. I loved flying itself, but it was way too expensive for a hobby. And I wasn't going to end up with the career I thought I wanted at the time. What did I know? I was 22. But it was a chance for me to go back and revisit that time and revisit that knowledge and those feelings. I also at that time knew somebody who was an NTSB investigator, and we used to talk about the things he liked and didn't like about the job. So it was a pretty natural thing for me to step into this, especially coming out of the Night Stalkers, where I had done 30 or 40 books wrapped up around helicopters and the planes that are in the area. And so I'd been studying flight a lot and flight rules a lot. So it's very natural for me to step in and make this an NTSB technothriller. The autistic heroine. How did I come up with Miranda? Um, it comes from several sources. My kid is now grown and gone, and she is an autism therapist specializing in young kids, 3 to 6 year old. So that's when they can really affect transition, when they can really help them move from mid functioning to high functioning, teach them behaviors to help them deal with our real world. And so she started bringing autism references in, and she knew this early on. I didn't know what I wanted to do early on except fly the big plane. Um, by the time she was 15, she was bringing Temple Grandin books into the house, and it became part of her discussions. And boy, clarity I never had. So I wanted a character who was a genius about air crash investigation. And it was like, what if she had autism? So I turned to my kid and I said, what's that like? She said, I don't know. I don't deal with adults. I deal with kids. And apparently it's two very different regimens of thought and treatment and diagnosis and behavioral. So I had to go out and start researching autism. And before I knew it, I had Miranda Chase. But I wanted to ease in because I didn't want to offend anybody. So for the first draft of the first 4 books, the first release, I never actually said the word autism. And I started getting back from my readers, oh, thank you so much for giving me an autistic heroine. I have a kid who, I have a brother who I work with. And so I felt comfortable going back in and doing an edit and adding, maybe 6 places in each book that she has autism. And then I started to really research more what are some of the different challenges that people on the spectrum have compared, well, just to get by in our society. And so Miranda, each book, she's kind of acquiring another piece and having to face it and understand it and grow with it or not grow with it. And that's her disparate brain. That's why you'll see across all the titles, she's an evolving person on the spectrum, she in the beginning, she doesn't get metaphor. Metaphor is way beyond her, as it is for many autistics. She starts to get metaphor, but it's dicey. Sometimes she thinks she has it and then she doesn't. And she finally gets metaphor and she goes on to start learning whatever the next thing is. And so that's how she became an evolving, interesting character across time, is because the author, was easing into learning about autism and people and how they live when they're on the spectrum. I get a lot of questions about Miranda's Island. It is a real island. It's called Spiden Island. It's up in the San Juans. It's let's look at it physically first. So here it is, way up in the San Juan Islands, and the team house is down in Gig Harbor, just by Tacoma Narrows Airport. And they often interact with Joint Base Lewis McChord, which is one of the 5 largest U.S. military bases in the world. So there's a lot, and I lived up in this area for almost 40 years. And this is where I got the second half of my pilot's license. I started it in college in Maine, but I finished it here in Seattle. So it's an area I know well, and it's an area I enjoy immensely. So much so that my Where Dreams romance series is set in Seattle. My Firehawks military romantic suspense is actually set just at the south end. The white dot is the glacier atop Mount Hood. And Firehawks, their base is set just below Mount Hood. And Eagle Cove, I lived in a small town on the Oregon coast when I wrote the Eagle Cove books. So uh, it's a lovely area. I absolutely adored it. Back to her island. It actually does have a runway. There's a hangar in the middle of it, which I burned down in this book. She has a main house, and there's a little boathouse down at the end of the island. I don't know what Miranda has in there because she's never gone in the boathouse in a book. So I'll bet it was something cool, though. Someday maybe I'll find out. But the crazy thing about this island was I think it was the 50s, maybe it was the early 60s, somebody bought it and decided it should be a game park, a safari hunting park. And they stocked it with zebras and big game and Sitka deer and mouflon sheep and just birds. And it's not a big island. It's a half-mile wide and 3 miles long. And they turned it into this safari hunting camp. And John Wayne loved it. He used to fly up and come into the island so that he could hunt on the island. And it didn't last long because it's kind of like you run around in your golf cart and you shoot the animal who has nowhere to run. Was not a popular thing with anybody in the area. Plus, there are inhabited islands all around it, including a resort. And occasionally, the stray bullet would come winging through the trees, so they got shut down. And then there was the big herding, where they went through and they the island was narrow enough that volunteers came and they walked the length of the island, herding the big animals down toward one end so they could pick them up and move them to zoos and wherever they could disperse them. Had a friend who lived the next island over, and he said sometimes you'd wake up in the morning and there would be a zebra who had broken into your vegetable garden, who had swum across this channel to get away from the island. A couple of the species remain, so Miranda's Island is filled with wildlife. And it was bought by, years later, it was bought by the founder of Oakley, the bicycling and skiing sunglass company. And so it's privately owned. You can't go on it. There was a kids camp on it for a while, but there isn't anymore. So it was a perfect setting to be Miranda's personal island. So that's the story behind Spiden. The last thing I wanted to talk about here in the origins was I set out with a big series concept that wasn't going to make any sense until I had finished the whole series concept. And it's really very meta. It's something that I don't think a reader would ever pick out until I tell you about it. And that's kind of the fun. It's a writer cookie even more than it's a reader cookie. So the secret concept was the team has four core members. The first four books, you'll find that number one has Mike and Miranda. Number two has Jeremy and Miranda. Number three has Holly and Miranda's point of view. And then the last one doesn't have any of the other team. It's all from Miranda or the villains or other characters. But the first group of four was about their past. So each character is dealing with their past and who they were and who they are and who they might become. The second quartet through White Top is they're dealing with who they are now. It's like they're finally stopped dealing with all this past noise and they're starting to discover their place in a team and how they function together and who they are together. And Start the Chase is an odd book because it was 6 origin short stories. So it's by this time the team had grown to 6 people with the addition of Andy and Taz. So Start the Chase, each one gets their own little origin story. Then the third one is about who they want to become. So it's more about each of the characters stepping into who they are and what kind of a person they want to become and some growth for a new level of growth for the character. And then Griffin and Wedgetail isn't out yet. They're I'm not sure what they are yet. They're more, I think, the next level up. They're about the team functioning and how the team interacts with itself and team growth and family and so on. But those first 12 books actually had a plan from the first day to be the past, present, and future of each of the main characters on the teams. I just thought I'd share that one. Thanks for joining me for this journey. Please visit my website at mlbuchman.com. There's more information about books, newsletters. Feel free to ask me a question. There are contact forms all over it. There's also the links to bonus scene short stories. Make sure you read the bonus scene for this book. It's wonderful. Maps. So enjoy and thanks so much for joining me.